Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced and welcome to another video in our intro to React 2024. And in this video, what I want to do is talk about context. Context is basically another feature of React, and there's a hook that's related to it called useContext. But essentially, useContext is another way to pass data around from components. Really useful when you have really deeply nested components. So let's just do an example. Okay, so I'm going to create another folder here. We're going to call this new folder context lesson. Okay, and then I'm going to create a new file called context lesson.jsx. Okay, and let's just make our boilerplate function context lesson. Okay, and it's just going to return a div that says context lesson. And we are going to export default context lesson. And I'm going to need sort of 3 more of these. So we're going to say new file level1.jsx. And you'll see what I mean. So in this case, this is going to all become level 1. Okay, and then we will make a level 2. So actually, let me copy this and make a new file level2.jsx. Okay, and then just use my multi-insert cursor there. Okay, 2. Okay, and then make one more new file level3.jsx. Okay, and then let's mount our lesson component. So I'm going to head back to our app.js. Let's get rid of the form lesson, which was our last lesson. And now we're going to import context lesson. Okay, and then we will mount that in our app component. And that's going to become our new component. Okay, that's fine. Okay, let's do it this way. Context lesson. There we go. Okay, so what's the story with first? To understand why we need context, you have to understand or how to use context. First, we need to understand why. And the reason is a problem called props drilling. Okay, so imagine that we're going to have a component tree where context lesson is the parent, and then level 1 will be the child, and then level 2 will be a child of level 1, and level 3 will be a child of level 3. Okay, so let's set that up. So in this case, in context lesson, we would import level 1. Okay, and then I can pass level 1 in here. Okay, and then we go to level 2, and here, or we go to level 1 actually, and then here I would import level 2. Okay, and then level 2 would be used inside of level 1, making it a child of level 1. Okay, and then we go to level 2, and we import level 3. Import level 3. Okay, we say level 3. Okay, so cool. Now, if I go here to my component tree, so if I go over here and I refresh the page, okay, and I go to components, looking at React Dev Tools, you will be able to see sort of what's going on here. Okay, so you see context lesson. Who's the child of context lesson? Level 1. Who's the child of context of level 1, level 2, and who's the child of level 2, level 3. Okay, so you can see that hierarchy. So the idea is, what if I want to pass I have some variable in context lesson. So we'll say, hey, I have some cheese. So context or const cheese equals Gouda. And I want that to show up in level 3. Okay, based on what we know so far, the way I'd have to do this is I would have to go pass it as props. So we'll say cheese equals cheese. Okay, so there I passed that down. Okay, and if I go here, I can take a look at level 1, and I can see level 1 now has the props of cheese. Okay, I can see that right there. See if I make this bigger. Does that make the DevTools bigger? No. Okay, but you can see that, hey, look, it's good as there. Okay, wonderful. Now, in that case, to get it from level 1 to level 2, I have to head over to the level 1 component and then pass that prop. So I have to make sure I declare props here. And then I have to say, oh, well, level 2 also receives a cheese prop, which is going to equal props.cheese, because it's going to equal the props that we got from the parent component. Okay, and then we want to get that from level 2 down to level 3. Well, then we have to be like, okay, declare props in this component. And then once again, say, hey, we're going to send a cheese prop down to level 3, which is going to equal the prop we received at this level, props.cheese. Okay, and now if I look at this, cheese now has, level 3 now has the Gouda prop. So you see I had to pass it from here to here, and then from here to here, and then from here to here. So you can see, like, passing data down several different layers of your application, several different layers of the component tree, can get kind of tedious. Okay, and now I can use it in level 3. I go to level 3 component, now I can use it. I declare props. Oops. I declare props. And then I can say, hey, I want to use show props.cheese here. Okay, awesome. Okay, and there it is. Now we see Gouda. So that Gouda came all the way up from context lesson all the way down to here to level 3. So that can be a very, very tricky way to pass down your data as your application gets more and more complicated. So the trick is to use a feature in React called context. Okay, so in that case, basically what we would do is I'm going to head back to context lesson, and we'll do it in here. So basically we want to import a few things from React. We want to import createContext, and we're going to want, actually that's all we really need here. Okay, so we have to do, and we do this outside of the function because this is not a hook. So notice, again, it doesn't start with the word use. So it's not a hook, so it doesn't have to be used inside the component. What we want to do is create a context. So const our context equals create context, and then we'll just pass it null for now. Okay, that's cool. Now let's console log it so we can see what this actually is. Our context. What is this? What is this giving us? Okay, now if we go back to our console and take a look at what gets console logged, okay, you'll see that you have an object that has two things in it, a consumer component and a provider component. So that's what context is. It's really two components, a provider, which provides information, and then a consumer, which can consume that information. So the idea is that if I can put the provider wherever the information lives, and then put the consumer where I need the information, I can skip all the steps in between. Okay, so typically what we do here is this variable here, we're going to want to send out. But again, I already have an export default, and you only can have one export default per file. So how's that going to work? Well, you are allowed, even though you can only have one export default per file, you can have as many exports as you want. So I can export that context. Okay, but when you export it, that means when you import it, you have to use the curly brackets like I did here with createContext. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's the difference between using export versus export default. When you use export default, I don't need the curly brackets, and I can just import it with any name that I want. Okay, here I have to use the exact name. Okay, so in that case, we have our context here, and the idea is that I want to deliver information from this level, so I have to use that provider component, because this is going to be the component that delivers the information. So what I'm going to do is that since the context exists here, I can just use it. So I can just say, hey, our context dot provider. Okay. Okay, and honestly, I should probably make this uppercase, just in case we don't run into any issues with the Babel transpiler, because again, it looks for that capital letter. So I'm going to change this to O, but I'm going to change this to O as well, to capital O, our context. So there's our context provider, and I'm just going to wrap everything in there. So the way the provider works, and let me just say this so you can see this a little bit more clearly. Okay, the way the provider works is that anything that's a child of it, so you notice that, hey, like this is the closing tag and here's the opening tag, so these are the children. Anything in here has access to the information that this provider provides. Okay, so in this case, what we do is we have a prop that we can pass, which is called, I think it's, isn't it value? Okay, yeah. So it is value, okay? And essentially what this value prop is the information you want to send down. Okay, so in this case, what I want to send down is, let's say, an object with the, what I want to send down is an object with a vegetable, a bread, and the bread is wheat. Okay, so that's the information that's being sent down. That's the value that this provider provides. Okay, so now anyone down the component tree from this component can now access that. So how would I do that? Okay, let me just get rid of this console log here. How would I do that is I would go to the component where I want to use the data. So I want to skip level 1, I want to skip level 2, and I go to level 3. And what I can do is I can import the context. So I would just import, okay, our context. Now notice again, I have to use the curly brackets because again, we didn't use export default. We used the word export to export. That's called a named export versus a default export. Okay, so now I have the context, and what I also need from React is there's a hook, import useContext. Okay, and the way this hook works is that's going to allow us to extract the information from the provider pretty easily. So what we do is we'll just say const data, okay, or we'll say const ctx for context equals use context, and then I pass it the context, our context object. And basically what this does is this function is going to go inside this here, take a look for the provider component, grab the value and return it. Okay, it's like cool, and that's going to be right over here. And now if I console.log ctx, I'll see that I'm getting that object. So I can see there, see, I'm getting bread wheat. Okay, so now what I can do is I can say, hey, ctx.wheat. Okay. Oops, that didn't show up the way it's supposed to. Okay, context.wheat. There we go. Okay, and there we go. Oh no, it's not context.wheat, it's context.bread. Wheat's the value. Okay, and you see the value is wheat. Okay, so that's what context does. It passes data down layers. It's like an elevator instead of walking down the stairs, the stairwell. Okay, that's the way I like to think about it. Like using props, it's like walking down a stairwell. I have to go down one layer after the next. Context is like having an elevator. Now, should you always use context? No, because the problem with context is that it's harder to understand. Like when I look at props, I always know props is coming from the parent component. So if I'm looking at somebody else's code, I can say, okay, well, I want to know where that variable is coming from. So I just need to go to the parent, figure out what the parent component is, examine where it's coming from in there, and kind of go from there. So I can trace back my steps. It's much easier to trace back someone else's steps when you're using props. With context, well, I have to go figure out where that context provider is, which could be anywhere up the component tree. So I have to now like discover where that is and what values it's passing down, which again isn't horrendously difficult, but again it's a little bit less clear. Second issue with context is that then that component is not reusable because it's dependent on that context existing. So again, what I would do is I would still have the display components receive the data via props, and then you have like your stateful components that handle like data fetching. So essentially the context would be handled from your stateful components, and then you would pass the data as props to a component that handles the display logic. Okay, generally the components that handle the display logic should generally always receive props. So that way you can literally always just reuse them anywhere, And then all you have to think about is, that component doesn't have to think about where the data is coming from. It's always receiving it from its parent. Then the parent can be responsible for figuring out where the data comes from. So, but a couple other things you can do with context. Another thing you can do is you can use this to help pass around stateful pieces. So for example, let's say we bring in useState to create some state. And now what I want to do is create a state. So let's say const count set count. So we're going to create our counter. Okay, equals useState 0. Okay, cool. So there's my count and set count. And what I can do is I'll create my function. We'll say const add1 equals a function that whenever it's run, all it's going to do is set the count to the old count plus 1. Okay, that's what that's going to do. Okay, and there should be an arrow right here. Okay. So now all I want to do is that now inside the object that I'm shipping down, I can ship down the state. So if I want to ship down count, I put that in my context. And if I want to put down that add1 function, I can add that to my context as well. And see now that that's the state, and the function that changes, and a function that would update that state now becomes part of the elevator. So now I can send those down to level 3, because level 3 has it. But again, level 3 is now a stateful component, and I don't want this handling my display logic. So I can make a level 4 file, which we'll call, actually I'll just make a counter component. Counter.jsx, function, counter. Okay, again, it's going to receive some props. Okay, more specifically, it should receive, I want it to receive 2 particular props. I want it to receive a value and a update value prop. Okay, that's what I expected. And actually we'll call it a val prop, just in case there's some built-in value prop that might interfere. Okay, so now basically all I want to do here is just return. Okay, return a div. In the div we'll have an h1 that displays the value. And then below it we'll have a button that says click. And then when you click on that button, on click, we run the update value function. Okay, so see, there's our stateful component. I mean, our stateless component. Default export default counter. So the beauty of this component is that it has no state. It has no dependency on anything other than what's written in this file. So there's nothing imported. Okay, it will receive some props, and those props could be anything from anywhere, and it will display whatever value we give it, and will run any function when we click this button. Cool, simple. So now what I can do is I can go back to level 3, import that counter component. Okay, and now instead of returning this, I can say, hey, I want to return counter, but I'm going to use the val. It's going to equal context, because again, we shipped down the count in the context, and we want to ship the update value, which will be the context dot add 1, because we shipped that down in the context as well. And here we go. Okay, and the button works. So you see, like, technically the state, so if we go back to our React Dev components, basically the state lives here. We shipped it down using context to level 3, but again, we don't want necessarily that to be where we handle the display, because we want to keep our components reusable. You can, if you don't really care about your reusability, but to have components that are nice and isolated and reusable, I basically then use that component to pass it down as props to my counter component, which actually handles the displaying of the UI. Okay, And because of this sort of separation of concern, separating, hey, displaying my UI logic versus handling my stateful logic in different components, that counter component can be used throughout throughout this application in different contexts without me necessarily having to say, hey, I always want to use it at count 1. I can go maybe ship it a different state with a different counter somewhere else down the line. Okay, so that's how this context works. So again, key points to remember. Okay, basically to create a context, you use this createContext function. That's going to create a context, which has two components: the provider component, which allows us to provide a piece of data down the component tree. So any child of context lesson, see there's the context provider, and any child of the context provider can now access that data, which could include, again, stateful, state, and things that update state. It can be literally anything that you ship in your context. Oftentimes used for application settings, so, like a color scheme or something like that, so that we can, you don't have to keep passing all the color scheme as props. And then anywhere you want to use it, you would just use you would import the context variable and the useContext hook. You pass our context to the context hook, the useContext hook, and that's going to return the value that's being passed down by the provider, which you can then do what you want. In this case, I'm passing it down to the counter component and letting the counter component handle the UI or display logic. So with that, hopefully that gives you a better idea of how to use context. There's a lot of different ways you can use it. You can have more than one context, different contexts for, different bundles of information. Just, again, use it sparingly. Okay, basically the way I think about it is that if I need it up my component tree and I need it to use that data maybe 4 or 5 layers deep, then context makes sense. But I'll still create like a layer component that receives the context and still distributes that down to the UI components via props. So the idea is I'll have certain like data layers. So there'll be certain like sort of floors where data gets delivered up and down, okay, through the elevator. And again, the elevator only goes down, so technically the way they deliver up is still passing down functions, but the idea is that I try to keep all the stateful logic in these components that only handle that, and then basically the actual components that display stuff, they are just placeholders waiting for functions and values to create the functionality that you want. And if you try to parse that out, you'll create much more modular, maintainable applications. So with that, I'll see y'all later. Have a great one. Ciao.